I still remember the smell of rain on the porch that morning, the way it mixed with coffee and wet wood, the way everything felt solid and real and mine. And I think that's what they couldn't stand. That I had something so completely my own in a world where women like me weren't supposed to hold on to anything for long, especially not a house with good bones and a garden that bloomed without permission. My grandmother left it to me. Not to my brother, not to anyone else, just to me. And I knew the moment I saw their faces at the funeral that this was going to be a problem. My uncle didn't look at me during the service. He looked past me, through me, at the house itself like it was a separate entity that had betrayed him by landing in the wrong hands. And my cousin Sarah, sweet Sarah with her painted nails and her husband who worked in real estate, she touched my arm and said we should talk. Really talk. About what made sense. And I remember thinking how strange it was that making sense always seemed to mean giving something up. They started slowly, the way water starts slowly before it becomes a flood. Little comments at first, observations really, about how big the house was for one person, how much work it needed, how the neighborhood was changing, not in a good way they said, though they never specified what way exactly. And I'd nod and pour more tea and say nothing, because I'd learned early that silence makes people nervous enough to show their hands. My uncle came by one Tuesday. I remember because it was trash day and the bins were out on the street making everything look temporary and disposable. He sat in my grandmother's chair without asking and told me about a developer, a friend of a friend, someone interested in the property. Not in me. Never in me. Just the land beneath my feet. And he had papers. Actual papers in a folder. Photocopies of tax assessments and maintenance records I'd never seen before. Numbers that seemed designed to frighten me, to make me feel like I was drowning in a responsibility I couldn't handle. And maybe I was. Maybe I wasn't. But the choice should have been mine. I said no the first time. And the second time. And the third time I stopped counting because the asking became a kind of weather. Always there. Always pressing down. My brother called from Arizona where he'd moved to escape everything, including himself. And he said, think about it. Really think about it. You could do so much with that money. Travel, start over, live a little. As if living required leaving. As if home was something you were supposed to outgrow like baby teeth or training wheels. And I wanted to ask him what he thought I'd been doing all this time while he was finding himself in the desert, whether he thought I'd been sleeping through my own life. But I didn't ask because I already knew he wouldn't understand. Men rarely do when a woman claims space in the world and refuses to apologize for it. The pressure changed shape after that, became something I couldn't quite name. My car got keyed in the driveway. Just once. Just enough to make me wonder. And the neighborhood association sent letters about my fence, about my mailbox, about violations I'd apparently been committing for years without anyone caring until suddenly they did. And I absolutely knew this wasn't coincidence. This was orchestration, someone pulling strings I couldn't see. And when I tried to talk to Sarah about it, she got very quiet and said, maybe it's a sign. Maybe the universe is trying to tell you something. And I thought how convenient it was that the universe always seemed to want women to make themselves smaller, to take up less room, to accept less than they deserved and call it wisdom. I held out for 2 years. 2 years of phone calls and visits and casual encounters at the grocery store where people I'd known my whole life suddenly had opinions about my choices, about my stubbornness, about my inability to see reason. And I started to feel crazy. Genuinely crazy. Like maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was being difficult for no good reason. Maybe holding on to a house was a kind of sickness and everyone could see it but me. And that's when I understood what they were doing. Not legally. Not in any way I could prove, but psychologically, they were making me doubt my own reality, my own right to exist in the space my grandmother had given me. And I think that's when something in me started to break. Not all at once, but slowly, like ice cracking under weight. The final push came from an unexpected place, a letter from the county about back taxes I supposedly owed, taxes that had somehow been calculated incorrectly years ago, and were now due immediately with penalties and interest. And the number was staggering, genuinely staggering, more than I had, more than I could borrow. And when I called to dispute it, I got transferred 7 times and eventually disconnected. And I knew, sitting there with the dial tone in my ear, that someone had arranged this. Someone with connections and patience and a very clear goal, and I could fight it. Spend years fighting it. Drown in legal fees and paperwork and the slow grinding machinery of bureaucracy. Or I could surrender. And I was tired. So tired I could barely remember what it felt like to not be tired. And that's the thing about pressure. It doesn't have to break you all at once, it just has to outlast you. I sold the house 6 weeks later for $60,000, which was criminal. Absolutely criminal. The land alone was worth 3 times that, and everyone knew it. But the developer, my uncle's friend, the only buyer who'd been allowed to make an offer, said, "Take it or leave it." And I took it because I didn't know what else to do. Because I was 32 years old and I felt like I'd already lost every battle that mattered. And I signed the papers in a lawyer's office that smelled like old carpet and broken dreams. And my uncle was there. And Sarah. And they looked relieved. Genuinely relieved. Like I'd finally done the right thing. Like I'd finally learned my place. And I wanted to scream, but instead I smiled and took the check and walked out into sunshine that felt like a personal insult. I left town that same week. Couldn't bear to watch them tear down the garden or paint over the rooms where I'd grown up, where my grandmother had died, where every wall held memories that apparently had no market value. And I drove west with everything I owned in a car that barely ran. And I didn't cry. Not then. I was too angry to cry. Too hollow, like someone had reached inside me and scooped out everything that made me human and replaced it with static. And I thought about revenge constantly, obsessively. Imagined scenarios where I exposed them, ruined them, made them feel a fraction of what they'd made me feel. But I didn't know how. Didn't have the resources or the connections or the kind of cold patience that revenge requires. So instead, I just drove and tried to figure out how to build a life from nothing. I worked terrible jobs at first. Waitressing, retail, anything that paid cash and didn't ask too many questions, and I was good at it. Good at smiling when I wanted to spit. Good at taking orders from people who treated me like furniture. Good at surviving in spaces that didn't want me to thrive. And slowly, so slowly I barely noticed it happening, I started to learn things. About money, about people, about the systems that govern both. I took night classes in accounting, in business law, in all the boring practical subjects I'd ignored when I thought the world would be fair. And I realized something fundamental. The people who'd taken my house weren't smarter than me. They weren't better than me. They just understood how power worked and I hadn't. But I was learning, faster than they'd ever expect. 10 years passed like that. One job leading to another, one skill building on the next, and I became someone I wouldn't have recognized at 32. Someone harder and sharper and infinitely more patient. I worked in property management for a while. Learned how developers thought, how they moved money around, how they built empires on other people's losses, and I saved everything. Every dollar I didn't absolutely need to survive went into an account I never touched, never even looked at except to watch it grow. And it grew slowly at first and then faster, and I started investing. Small amounts at first, then larger, following patterns I'd learned to recognize. And I was good at it. Better than good. I had a talent for seeing what was coming before it arrived. Maybe because I'd learned to read people's intentions in their silences, in the things they didn't say. I didn't keep track of them at first. My family, the people who'd pushed me out. It hurt too much to think about them living in the space I should have had. But eventually curiosity won and I started searching online. Casual searches that became less casual. And I learned things, small things that added up. My uncle had retired early, moved to Florida. Sarah's husband had expanded his real estate business. Built a small empire, actually. And the developer who'd bought my house had torn it down exactly as I'd feared. Built 3 identical units in its place. Cheap construction with expensive facades. The kind of thing that looks impressive for about 5 years before it starts falling apart. And I felt something then. Not quite pleasure, not quite vindication, just a distant recognition that nothing lasts, especially things built on theft. 15 years after I left, I had enough money to do something with. Not rich money, Not inheritance money, but earned money, clean money, the kind that came from understanding how the game worked and playing it better than the people who thought they owned it. And I started looking at properties back home. Not obviously, not in my own name. I'd learned that much, at least. I used an LLC, hired a local agent who didn't know me, and I watched the market, watched it carefully, and I noticed something interesting. The neighborhood had changed exactly the way my uncle said it wouldn't. Property values had dropped. Crime had gone up. Those 3 units my developer had built were struggling to find tenants, and Sarah's husband's empire wasn't looking quite so impressive anymore. Foreclosures, bankruptcies, the kind of financial collapse that happens when you overextend yourself, assuming the good times will last forever. I waited another year just to be sure. Watched them struggle, watched them try to sell properties nobody wanted, watched the whole carefully constructed lie of their success start to crack and crumble. And then I made my move. Not directly, never directly, through lawyers and shell companies and all the boring technical machinery that keeps rich people rich and poor people poor. And I bought the land, my land, the place where my house had stood before they erased it. I bought it for $40,000, $20,000 less than they'd paid me, and the symmetry of that felt like justice, cold and mathematical and absolutely perfect. Nobody knew it was me at first. Nobody connected the LLC to the girl who'd left town broken and desperate 15 years earlier, and I kept it that way for months. Just sat with the knowledge that I owned it again, that I'd won it back not through begging or sentiment, but through patience and skill, and the same ruthless logic they'd used against me. And I thought about what my grandmother would say, whether she'd be proud or horrified or some complicated mixture of both. And I realized I didn't care. This wasn't about her anymore. Wasn't about them. It was about proving something to myself, about demonstrating that survival is its own form of revenge. I came back to town on a Tuesday, the same day of the week my uncle had brought those papers all those years ago, and I walked the land where my house had been, where those 3 units now stood empty and deteriorating, and I felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction. Just a kind of hollow recognition that winning doesn't always feel the way you think it will. And I realized something standing there. I didn't want to rebuild what they'd destroyed. Didn't want to try to resurrect some sanitized version of the past. I wanted something else entirely, something they couldn't have imagined. I demolished the units, all 3 of them, hired a crew, and watched them come down in a single afternoon. And I'm sure someone told my uncle. Someone must have. Small towns being what they are. But he never called, never reached out. And I understood that silence, recognized it as surrender. The same silence I'd given him when I signed those papers. And I thought about Sarah, too. About whether she even remembered what she'd done or whether she'd convinced herself it had all been necessary. All been for my own good. The way people do when they need to sleep at night. I didn't rebuild the house. Didn't try to recreate something that existed only in memory. Instead, I turned the land into a community garden. Free plots for anyone who wanted to grow something. No fees, no applications, no barriers except the willingness to show up and put your hands in the dirt. And I hired a local woman to manage it. Paid her well, gave her full authority, and I stayed in the background where I'd learned to operate best. And the garden grew, slowly at first, then faster. Tomatoes and peppers and herbs and flowers. All of it wild and real and completely unlike the manicured lawns the developers had promised would make the neighborhood valuable. People started calling it Grace's Garden, though I never asked them to. Never even told them my name was Grace, which it isn't. But I let them call it that anyway because names are just sounds we attach to things to make them feel permanent. And nothing is permanent. Not houses, not families, not the people who think they can take what isn't theirs and sleep soundly after. And I visit sometimes. Not often, just enough to see what's growing, to watch people who have nothing plant seeds and wait and believe in futures they can't yet see. And I think about my grandmother, about what she really left me. Not the house itself, but the stubborn belief that some things are worth holding on to even when the whole world tells you to let go. My uncle died last spring. I heard about it from someone who didn't know we were related. And I didn't go to the funeral, didn't send flowers, didn't acknowledge it in any way. And that absence was my final statement, the last thing I had to say to him. And I think he would have understood it, would have recognized it as the same cold calculation he'd used on me. And maybe in some other version of this story, I would have confronted him, would have made him admit what he'd done. But this isn't that story. This is the one where I learned that the best revenge isn't making people acknowledge their cruelty. It's building something beautiful in the exact space where they tried to destroy you and never explaining why. Sarah sent me a Facebook message 6 months ago. I don't know how she found me, what digital trail I'd left that led her back to someone I'd stopped being. And she said she'd heard about the garden, said it was lovely, said she hoped I was doing well. And I stared at that message for a long time, trying to decide what she wanted, whether it was absolution or connection, or just the comfort of pretending the past could be rewritten into something gentler. And I never responded. Left her on read the way they say. And that silence said everything I needed it to say. That some doors close and stay closed, and no amount of nostalgia can pry them open. I'm 49 now, living a life my 32-year-old self couldn't have imagined. Not because it's glamorous or because I'm rich. I'm not. I'm comfortable, which is its own kind of wealth. But because I learned something those people never understood, that power isn't about taking things from people. It's about knowing when to let go and when to hold on and having the wisdom to tell the difference. And I held on to myself when they tried to take that. Held on to the possibility that survival could be its own form of grace. And I let go of the need to make them understand, to make them sorry, to extract from them some acknowledgement that would never come because people like that don't apologize. They just find new reasons why they were right all along. The garden is thriving now, better than I ever expected. There are bees and butterflies and children who've never known a space that didn't demand something from them in return for existing. And sometimes I sit on the bench I installed under the oak tree. The one tree they didn't cut down. The one witness to everything that happened. And I think about the girl I was, the one who thought home was a place you could lose. And I understand now that home was never the house. It was the refusal to let them make me smaller, the stubborn insistence that I deserved to take up space in the world. And they couldn't take that, couldn't buy it or pressure it or legislate it away. It was always mine, and it's still mine, and it will be mine until the day I die. I never told anyone this story, never explained what happened or why I came back or what the garden means. And I'm telling it now not because I need anyone to understand, but because silence has its limits. Because some truths deserve to be spoken even if no one's listening, even if the only person who hears is the one doing the telling. And the truth is this: they tried to erase me, and I erased them instead. Not violently, not obviously, but completely. I made myself into someone they couldn't recognize, couldn't reach, couldn't hurt. And I came back not for revenge, but for reclamation, to prove that the space was always mine, that their claim to it was temporary and hollow and built on sand. And when the tide came in, and it always comes in, I was the one left standing. The house is gone, and I don't miss it. What I miss is the version of myself who thought walls and roofs were what made something worth fighting for, who didn't understand yet that the real battle was internal, was about refusing to internalize their assessment of my worth, their certainty that I was too weak or too foolish or too female to hold on to power. And I won that battle by becoming exactly what they feared most. Someone who understood the game better than they did, who played it with more patience, more precision, more absolute ruthless clarity about what mattered and what didn't. Sometimes people ask me what I do, what my story is, and I tell them I work in property management, which is true but incomplete, the way all true things are incomplete, and they nod and move on because it's a boring answer. An answer that doesn't invite questions, and that's exactly how I want it. I've learned to hide in plain sight, to be forgettable in all the ways that matter and unforgettable in the one way that counts. I am the woman who came back, who bought back what was taken, who turned theft into transformation and never said a word about it. And that silence is louder than any speech I could give, any explanation I could offer. It's the silence of someone who doesn't need your understanding because understanding was never the point. The point was survival, and then it was growth, and then it was return. And now it's something else entirely. Something I don't have a word for yet. Maybe wisdom. Maybe peace. Maybe just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that karma isn't something that happens to you. It's something you become. You become the answer to your own suffering. You become the justice you were denied. And you do it so quietly, so carefully that by the time anyone notices it's already done, the garden is already growing, the land is already yours, and there's nothing left to take because you've already taken it back. Not through force, but through patience. Not through anger, but through the cold, clear logic of someone who understands that the best revenge is living well, and the best justice is living free.